Welcome to Write Now Workshop Podcast, where you can write a book and change the world. I'm your host, Kitty Bucholtz, and this is episode 185, Writing Stories from Ancient History, an interview with Jill Eileen Smith, coming to you on Thursday, March 5th, 2020. So Jill and I actually talked a couple of weeks ago, but I wanted to wait until today to put her show out because her brand new book that we're talking about just came out a couple of days ago. I didn't want to tell you about it a couple of weeks ago and have you not be able to go check it out and maybe buy it because it's really good. So I also am doing this introduction just a tiny bit early because I am very excited to be at this moment on Thursday flying to London. I'm going to spend a week there going to the London Book Fair, which is very exciting. I've never been. I really want to go to the London Book Fair and the Frankfurt Book Fair just because it's books and it sounds exciting and I'm just excited to go. Oh my gosh, I'm going to have like my great tennis shoes on, even if it's cold out. I'm wearing tennis shoes instead of winter boots because I plan on walking and walking and walking the entire expo floor. Plus, there'll also be speakers and different interesting topics. Plus, very excited. I don't know, possibly, maybe more excited, but at least equally excited to be going to Mark Dawson's self-publishing show's first live event. Yay! It's the day before London Book Fair, which totally makes sense. There's going to be 1,000 writers listening to a lot, probably at least a dozen other writers talking about self-publishing and all sorts of things that I don't know what they're going to talk about yet because it hasn't happened. And then because all of us are getting together for that, some wonderful person who already lives in London made an arrangement that whoever wants to, and we have, I think, a fairly large group, can go up to, I think Milton Keynes is the name of the town. It's just outside London, where Ingram Spark has one of their facilities with the print-on-demand equipment and everything. And we get to take a tour. So that's happening for me tomorrow. I'm so nerdy. I totally cannot wait. There's so many different kinds of things that I have heard about with new technology and printing. I never did get to see an espresso machine, and I don't even know if anybody still uses it anymore. But 5 years ago, it was the new, brand new in thing. And I never did get to see one, but now I get to at least explore Ingram Spark and get the tour and totally nerdy thing that I'm excited about. And also, just because I'm a regular human being, just in case you're not as nerdy as me, though if you're listening to the writing podcast, you're at least nerdy in the same ways, or some of the same ways. But in a totally normal thing, I'm also excited because while I have never been outside of London, and I've only been to London, I think, for 3 days once, just a couple of months ago, a friend of mine moved to York, and I'm going to be able to go see York too, which I think is going to be a fairly significant train ride. Okay, depends on your idea of how long is long. I think it's a 3 or 4 hour train ride. But anyway, totally excited because I've never been to any of these other places. And I get to see my friend and see the English countryside, I guess. York would be considered part of the countryside, maybe. People who are listening from England are probably like giving me all sorts of advice in their mind about how I don't know what countryside is, or I don't understand how small it really is, or I don't know. But I'm excited. I'm excited to go see my friend Camilla. So yay! Yay for traveling to new places. And the thing about traveling to new places is that you usually get some amazing new idea, or other ideas, old ideas, kind of come together and do weird things in your mind. And then you get something that's kind of a new version of old ideas. So the nice thing about traveling and doing new things is I really have high expectations of having a lot of new and interesting information going through my mind, which means that I will be mentally exhausted for the entire week and come home and be really glad that it's time for the weekend. I hope that you are finding something like that you can do. Now, if you live someplace where you're like, yeah, I don't have time or money to go off someplace, well, think of someplace that you haven't been that you can get to. For instance, just within your own city, what's someplace that you've never been to? I sort of can't imagine why I would be interested in maritime stuff, but here in Malmö, there's a maritime museum, and I've heard from a couple of different people that it's kind of cool. And I keep thinking, you know what? You have no idea what it's like, Kitty, because you've never been there. You should just give it a try. And if it's ridiculous, then you can have, to me, if it's not at all interesting to me, it'll be a great character that I can create that's like, I hate museums. Because I can't write that character right now because I kind of do like museums. I didn't know I liked them until I started going to them. But see, that's another thing that you could find. So there is probably something somewhere near where you live that you could get to that you've never been to before. And you could see it from a new perspective, maybe from a new character's perspective. Who knows what could happen? But I highly, strongly encourage you to go find something that you haven't seen or done. Or like one of my friends was talking about going to an escape room. There's one here in Malmö called Sherlock, which apparently is all kinds of Sherlock Holmes style puzzles and stuff. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that sounds so fun. Never done any kind of escape room. So there's so many things that we could try and just figure out, I don't know, how to work it into a story or a backstory for a character. And that's what I'm always thinking. So whatever you are doing right now as you're listening to the podcast, whatever you're about ready to be doing because the weekend's coming, I hope that you are finding a new way to look at it. And in fact, that kind of segues right into talking to Jill because she has taken ancient history and stories written hundreds and thousands of years ago and found new ways to create a story that's really intriguing. And like for me, this book that she wrote that we're talking about, I already know the story. I know how it ends, but the whole way through the book, I'm like, okay, I have to read to the end because I want to know how she gets it to the end. So there's so many interesting things that we can put in our books and interesting history and even just interesting reflections of what our characters think of things. And they can be what we think of them or the opposite or who knows what. Anything could happen because it's in your mind. So I hope that this is not too weird and mostly just encouraging to go find something new that you haven't done or seen and figure out something that you could do with it. In the meantime, here's Jill. Today's guest is Jill Eileen Smith. Jill is the best-selling and award-winning author of the biblical fiction series, The Wives of King David, Wives of the Patriarchs, and Daughters of the Promised Land, as well as The Heart of a King and the nonfiction book, When Life Doesn't Match Your Dreams. Her research into the lives of biblical women has taken her from the Bible to Israel, and she particularly enjoys learning how women lived in Old Testament times. Jill lives with her family in Southeast Michigan. Welcome, Jill.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. I'm a Michigan girl too, so it's always fun having Michigan people on my show.
Oh, I know. I can't fathom the fact that you're in Sweden and I'm here, and it's so weird. But
it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great.
Well,
for having me.
For anyone who's watching on YouTube, we can show them where we live on our handy map, right?
Right. Wait, one's Israel, one's Michigan. So.
Oh, really? Can you do Israel on your hand?
Yeah.
Oh,
you can. Like? Let's see. This would be Israel, because over here is like Egypt, and up here would be like the way to Israel. But in Michigan, with the thumb, you have the thumb here. You have Detroit here. You have Traverse City over here.
Traverse City's here. Yep.
Wait,
way up at the top of the pinky. Yeah,
is it?
That's where I lived.
Okay, you know better than I do. Even I've traveled there, but I haven't lived there. So.
Yeah. Oh, and I hear that you guys have been getting some snow. It is February.
Yes, it always snows this time of year, but not much. We've got about very little, maybe an inch or two on the ground. But Traverse City got hit with a lot more, I heard. But they have the lakes. We don't have the lakes. So
Yeah.
I'm just hoping it stops soon. I don't want very much. I think we're only supposed to get about 3 inches. So
Oh, that won't be too bad.
no, we've had a really mild winter,
Same
surprisingly, because we
here.
usually want to go and leave Michigan in winter. We don't enjoy, yeah, we were in California last November to see in Oregon to see our family, and they got 10 inches of snow where we live here. By the time we got home, it was gone.
Oh my
And I'm like,
gosh.
I'm so glad we missed that. So
Yeah, I just took a train trip up to Stockholm, which is maybe not quite. First of all, I had no idea how long Sweden is. Like at some
really,
point, I need to compare the length of it compared to the length of California, which is
really,
super long.
it is.
It's crazy. So Stockholm is not even quite halfway, but
Okay.
still, it should have had snow. I saw like the teeny tiniest little dusting of snow part way up on the train, on the fields outside, and that was it. Nothing else.
I know last year we had two polar vortexes. It was so cold. And the last several birthdays, we've tromped through snow, like huge mounds of it. One time we went hiking to the cider mill I love just to take the path, but it was so much snow. I had to turn around and say, I can't do this. So,
Yeah.
but this year it's not as bad, thankfully, although it is snowing out there right now. So,
Oh man. Oh, kind of wish I was there just because, but
no,
but
you
I don't
don't.
have to snow. Yeah, I don't have to shovel anything here. So
Yeah, for sure.
all right. So you have a brand new book that at the time that listeners hear this episode just came out 2 days ago.
Yes.
Congratulations,
Thank
Star of
you.
Persia.
Yeah, I'm excited. I really am. This one was
Yay.
a book I never ever thought I'd write, and I don't know, it just changed over time. And it's like I was running out of women to write about, and we had this list. Then Ravel and I went over the list, and they picked the two, Esther and Miriam, and so the reason was I didn't know if I could do it any different than all the Esther versions I'd already read.
Yeah.
Her story's been done over and over again throughout my lifetime and before, I'm sure. And I had a friend who's a librarian send me a copy of a really old version I'd never read, and I read it, and I'm like, I could never do better than this, or not that I need to be better than, different
Yeah.
than, as I guess is the right word. But years went by, and then I thought, well, maybe I can. So it's kind of like, since I'm a Christian, it's always to me a God, putting things in my path, and I kind of feel like he leads me to the point where I'm finally ready to do something. Or if I get stumped on a book that is like so hard, there's nothing on this person in Scripture. It's like this much, and but he always helps me figure out how to make it work. I don't know how. I mean, David was so easy. The first 3 books I did,
Yeah.
so much on him and his wives. I mean, his wives are minimal, but on his life, you can really figure that out. But you start, like, I got to Rebecca and I nearly cried because it was so hard. And then I got to Deborah and thought, you thought Rebecca was hard? And then I got to Esther and it wasn't so bad, but I just finished the worst book ever. Now, it isn't the worst book ever to read, I
Hardest.
hope, but the hardest one to write. Yeah.
Yeah. And that
So,
one is Miriam.
yeah. Because there's nothing on her either at all. I
Oh,
mean, there's like this much. You don't even know if she was married. They never mention
wow.
a husband or sons or daughters, or everything that's said about her could be summed up in one paragraph.
Oh man.
So, and Deborah at least got 2 chapters.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So
But
So regarding fiction, so
mhm,
far everything that you've written in fiction has been historical figures from the Bible, right?
right.
Okay.
All the Old Testament. So you could actually say in fact, I spoke to a Jewish group once because it's their Torah that I'm usually, and their prophets, and I haven't really gotten into the prophets. It's mostly the Torah I'm working from. So hopefully I'm keeping true to the way they see it too, except sometimes I don't, because their rabbis interpret things in ways I don't see it
Okay.
the same way, because I have the New Testament I also refer to, and I might learn something in the New that speaks about something in the Old, and they don't do that. unless some of them do. I don't know if they read the New Testament, but typically the commentary from the rabbi will be different than the commentary from, a Christian publication. And so I have to find which one works, and maybe I don't use any of them and I just go with what I think fits, so but sometimes we have disagreements on like who married who and, little things like that. It's not huge.
Yeah.
It's never.
So for all of your stories, you're taking, I was reading in your press release, you're taking what's written in the Bible and then commentaries. And then also, at least for Esther, you were able to find ancient history documents that cover the same time period and then some of the same people.
Yes. First time it happened, because if you look at, well, I didn't really search for it in David's era. And actually in David's era, they didn't even know. I mean, historically, people denied his existence at first until, there was no evidence in archaeology to prove that there was a Davidic kingdom or Solomon had this huge, reign over all this land until Tel Dan, they found a little, I forget how you pronounce it, but a little clay thing that said House of David on it. And that's when they recognized that he was at least a historical figure. But you can't go back and like read commentaries from the time on those people. They're not there. And then you go back 1,000 years to Abraham and you've gotten even less information. But jump ahead to Esther. Now, Xerxes was known in ancient history as a historical figure. And Herodotus writes about him. Herodotus was Greek, so you can't take everything he says against the Persians as accurate because, there was some conflict there because Xerxes tried to conquer Greece and he didn't win. So I had to take Herodotus's points of view with a little bit of grain of salt, but maybe he was biased. But he did name names, and he didn't name Esther or Vashti. They don't show up in secular history, but the woman that had Darius II and Artaxerxes and maybe a couple more boys by Xerxes was named Amestris. And so then you look in the Bible, and the person who succeeded Xerxes was Artaxerxes. He's actually a biblical and a historical figure. So I figured, okay, Herodotus has got some accuracy going on here. And so Amestris was this real person who's not in Esther's story. And some scholars thought, well, is Vashti Amestris? Is Esther Amestris? And I'm like, but her character was not good. She was cruel. The way Herodotus described her was like, are you kidding me? Really? She did that? I'm like, no, I'm not putting that in the story. But I couldn't see Vashti or Esther in either of that characterization. So I created her character, and now we have 3 women in the story instead of just Vashti and Esther. So that, I think, sets my version apart from some of the other stories on Esther that maybe don't add the secular history to the biblical.
Yeah. I have to say, first of all, Christian, but never found biblical fiction very interesting. I'm not really a ancient history kind of person, and I usually never could get into it. And the thing is, though, is that I saw the word Esther in your book description. I'm like, yes, I am going to interview this woman and read her book because I just like Esther. And not even because, that's the book that, we've been in the last 10 or 20 years, really making such a big deal of the one line that her cousin Mordecai says, you might have been put here for just such a time as this.
Yeah.
That's not even the reason I like her. I just like her because she seems like a nice girl that I would be friends with.
Yeah.
Seems like a good girl.
Everybody loved her, even in the palace, it said. So she had to have had a lot of grace and, character and kindness and, compassion. I'm sure she had her flaws, but, she had a lot of things about her that drew people to her and to accept and like her and win Xerxes' heart, of course, but I think that was God's favor on her. But, he wanted her there for such a time as this.
Yeah.
So, yeah, she was fun. Her book in the Bible is a little anticlimactic. So my book does not follow all the way to the very end of the biblical story. Mm-hmm. But it's everyone I encourage to go read the biblical part, because my book's just, fiction. It's fiction. You can't take everything I am going to say in that book as fact. I always encourage my readers, put it up side by side against what the biblical account is, and then so you know which one I believe scripture to be true, so then you can throw out my ideas or keep them, whatever you want.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I thought was fun about your book, and then, listening to how you were able to take a mistress from the secular fiction, and then Vashti and Esther being as part of the biblical story, and put them together. I'm like, oh my gosh, what a gift that God's like, here, I'm going to help you make your story even more interesting, because it'll have lots more conflict. It was totally believable. Like, I know it's fiction, but I'm reading it just going, oh my gosh, watch your back. She's going to get you, and I just loved it. There was so many parts. Yeah. The conflict and the fact that Esther was so kind and nice to the younger son. But then, having a mistress be angry that her younger son thought that Esther was nice. And I just thought, this is totally normal, believable stuff that I would believe about, people.
Well, and part of the reason I made him like her is because when Artaxerxes did take the throne, he was kind to the Jewish people. And so, eventually maybe there was that connection, who knows, but it made it more believable to me that if he met a Jewish queen that was nice to him, then he would, when he was king, be nice to her people, and he was a good king apparently at the time. So
yeah. All right, so let's talk a little bit about research. I've interviewed lots of people, talking to them about different areas of history that they've had to, really get into to understand, how their story could fit in with real history. And when they were making decisions about, well, I'm going to make this slightly different from what really happened because I need it for the story, but I'll let people know, in the afterword or whatever. But what really struck me reading your press release is that, if I'm reading it right, from the time that you published your first work of biblical fiction, you were publishing about one a year after that. It says 9 more books, and I did 11 more books. Anyway, I did it on my fingers, and I'm like, Mom, but that's a book a year. And yet, I mean, it seems to me you would have to do so much research to get the details right, or maybe I just don't understand that a lot of the time periods are really similar. But then when you and I started talking, you were like, I really should be studying for the next book that I'm writing. So tell us, how in the world do you take ancient history and learn it well enough to put it into a story that makes it feel like Esther feels very smooth and believable, and it doesn't feel like I'm reading something of history. It's just a great story.
Thank you so much. That makes me feel good.
Yay.
Honestly, okay, the very first series I did took me 20 years to break into, and I started David back, first it was a co-taught Bible study with a girlfriend on David's life. We got to and we went in depth. I mean, if you do Beth Moore's Bible study on David, that's how in depth we went. So I really knew him. I mean, I had figured a lot out. But then I was like, I want to read a novel about him, and I couldn't find one. And I didn't know how to write, so 20 years was why, because I didn't know how to write. But I also studied him for about 7 years, on and off while raising kids and all that stuff. So I really knew the wives of David. I knew King David. I mean, I knew that everything you could imagine. I had studied the cultural atlases, the life in biblical times, the commentary after commentary, and all these different things. There's just so much on him from 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st Kings and Psalms, and Even in the New Testament, he's mentioned. And so I just knew his whole life really well. I could probably teach a study on him and really enjoy it because I loved doing that series. But then you went back 1,000 years to Abraham in ancient Mesopotamia, and you were in ancient Israel. So now I don't know anything about ancient Mesopotamia 1,000 years earlier. That really made me have to buy a whole bunch of books on ancient Mesopotamia and read about their ancient gods. There was this, they discovered I want to say funeral, that's not it, a grave filled with all kinds of stuff that taught them or told them so much about the period of that time. So I learned.
Are you talking archaeology?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
So I love archaeology. Not that I get into it that much, but when they discover something, it's cool. So I had all that to research so I could set it in a different time. The customs weren't that different, but little things mattered. Like, you'd be surprised. In writing, it's like silly, but when I did, because I have some contemporary stuff on my computer, and you can say a minute later but in ancient history, they didn't measure time by minutes. You have to say a moment later. Or could they have had silk fabric? Well, when was the Silk Road invented? And was it the bronze? Did they have iron? Could they use, did they have access to lots of silver and gold? And what kind of tools did they have? And just all that is different. Did they live in tents or houses? What their houses look like? How did they cook? What kind of food did they eat? So I did all that with that series. And then I went through to the Judges era, and that's in between both. And it's kind of like, okay, it's not that much different. So the research was already in my head, wasn't as hard to do. And when I got to Esther, that's when I had to do the Persian, a little bit more understanding of, okay, Israel had been taken captive, they'd been let go, but why did Mordecai stay? Because they could have gone back to Jerusalem. And, just so much history transpires during those different eras that it takes just making sure you've got it placed. It's hard for me, especially if I'm trying to mesh an era of ancient history with biblical when the timing isn't certain and God's not telling us. You know what I mean? It's like I mentioned to you before we started, the Exodus for my next book, no one knows when exactly that took place. Now, God said it took place 430 years after they entered Egypt, but we don't know what year they entered Egypt for sure. I mean, I've watched a commentary on I don't know, Prime TV or something, and it was talking about a set for an earlier or a later Exodus and which one was better. So it's like, that's the kind of stuff I end up having to piece together, and I nearly drive myself crazy with every book I write. And every time I start one, I look at my husband and say, why did I sign this contract? I can't do this book. The first draft's going to kill me. And then I get to the end, and then I'm like, okay, I can go on to the next one. So.
Now, you also said that last year and this year will be similar, that you've got book releases and then edits for the next book coming really close together. Did I get that right?
Yeah, this year. Well, last year I signed a contract to do one standalone book for Guideposts. It's a standalone, but it's in a series they're doing, and it's just a work for hire. And Ravel said go for it, but I told my agent, if I ever want to do more than one book a year, just shoot me, because I can't. It's so hard. But it was, it was interesting, and that book's due in May. So in March, I've got Esther, or Star of Persia, is releasing the 3rd, and we're having a Facebook party if anyone wants to come.
Good.
It'll be 2 days later, though, so you'll have missed it.
Right. But, no, that's true.
Oh, well. Anyway, I'm doing a Facebook party, and Ravel gives away prizes. And so then, and they're doing a Goodreads giveaway, but that will have ended by now. And they're doing a pre-order thing, but that will have already ended. So I'm sorry about that.
But the book's available today.
But the book's available, yes. And there could be, sales in the future. They're always running things like that. But anyway, what was I going to say? After it releases, sometime in March, I'm supposed to begin edits on She Walked Before Us, which is my second nonfiction, which is coming out September 2020. So, and then in May, I turn in the Guideposts book, and I'll have edits on that, I'm sure, a little bit somewhere along the round. And in between, I have to start studying who I already know a little because of Rachel and Jacob, and the whole Rachel story had Joseph in it, but the next book's about Joseph. And so I already have that study a lot in my head, but I have to form how I'm going to tell the story, and I don't know that yet. And that's always the hard part. So
now, will that be the first book that's where the book is about a man? Because you've got wives and daughters and...
Well, the Loves of King Solomon was, okay, the Heart of a King, I'm sorry. Loves of King Solomon were 4 ebooks I did when I was also writing 1 book a year. So they were short, they were easier. So I was doing kind of a book and a half a year for a few years before I took on the nonfiction last year. So it's been almost 2 books a year for quite a few years. And then this last year I did the 3, which is more than my body can take. I'm sitting at the computer, but anyway, although I'm grateful. I don't mean to sound ungrateful. It's just hard on me. But anyway, the Loves of King Solomon, they're all ebooks. And I do get letters from readers that want them in paperback. And it's like, they're ebooks only. And that's always been the case because they wanted my final to be a compilation of the 4. And I get bored with repeating the same thing. I didn't want to just mesh it together. I wanted to give Solomon a point of view. And so I switched the whole thing to third person. It had been every woman was in first person in the ebook. I put it all in third. I put his point of view. So the Heart of the King is really his story, even though all 4 women from those ebooks are in it. So that was the first male lead. With on the cover, there's a man and a woman. And so Joseph is the second male, but they wanted 2 more women to follow, but they're to be determined. So, but once I get Joseph started and turned in next year, then I'm down to 1 book a year until I'm out of contract, unless I get another contract. So
okay. Now, again, reading your press release, and you had a really good press release. It gave me lots of places to go with questions. So even though this is in some ways only your second book where the man is kind of the main character, I believe that you said that in order to get all the information you needed on all of these other women, you kind of had to start with their father, brother, husband, the man in their lives who was written about. Can you tell us about that?
Well, when I did David, I did David. I knew nothing about writing, and I wrote a 2-volume epic on David with all his women, all his escapades, everything. And it went to 28 publishers, and thankfully nobody wanted it. I didn't know what I was doing. It was at that point where I met an editor at Harper and Row, who ended up being my editor at Revell, who suggested I do McCall, and I turned her down back then when I knew nothing. But later, when I finally figured out how to tell stories and had a lot of years under my belt, and then we had biblical fiction finally take a turn to come back because it was out of vogue in the Christian market for a long time. It ended in the 80s, and I didn't sell till 2007. So, but when it came back with my series. So I was excited about that. But yeah, I had to know David to do his women. I just switched from his point of view all the time to being more about them. And so when it came to like the Loves of Solomon, those women, the Queen of Sheba, how much do we know about her? There's some things in folklore. Ethiopia and Arabia both claim her. So she was a real person. Abishag was David's last wife that wasn't a wife. Let's see, who else do we have? Naamah was Solomon's first wife who gave birth to his heir. And then, the Egyptian princess, when he marries someone from Egypt, who we don't have a name for, she's just a princess and gets a palace of her own. And we know nothing else. So what do you do with this? You've got names and you've got teensy little bit about them. And so you have to understand Solomon if you're going to understand them. And so I already knew David. I knew a little about Solomon. So I studied more about Ecclesiastes and Proverbs and more of Solomon and in Kings. And I mean, I love Ecclesiastes. Silly as that sounds, that book is depressing, but it's also very realistic. And you see him as an older man looking back at his life and thinking how meaningless everything was. And I think it's because he pursued the gift rather than the giver. And so his life ended up feeling very, not worthless, but just vain. He wished he'd done it differently. And he could have, God loved him from birth, and he didn't have to chase 1,000 women, but he made a lot of foolish. I think he thought his wisdom would keep him safe from really upsetting God, but it didn't. And he learned that in the end. So, but yes, I had to learn about Solomon, and I had to learn about Xerxes and his battles and some of that with Esther. And Moses had to do a lot about him to do Miriam. And it's always because the Bible seems patriarchal, but it's not misogynic. Am I saying that word right? I
actually am not familiar. I mean, I've seen that word and usually just kind of skip over it and go, okay, I'll figure it out in context. But can you tell us what does misogenic mean?
Well, from what I understand it's not against women. It's not trying to put down women. It sounds like it sometimes because it's got laws that give men more authority. But I mean, there's also so much protection for women in the law. And there's also Jesus. I mean, when he came, the people who were paying attention and knew he was going to die, were the women. They followed him along. And I mean, they weren't among his 12 men, but they were right there in that group. They were the ones praying and anointing him. And a woman was the first person who saw him when he rose from the grave. And he elevated women to a high status that we don't recognize like as much as I think we should, because there's no difference between male, female, slave, free, Greek, or Jew, as the Bible puts it. We're all equal in God's eyes. He doesn't love David more than he loves you. He just doesn't. He doesn't. He doesn't show favoritism as much as men might. I mean, I have nothing against men. I have 3 boys. I love men. That's why I love the male point of view. I love my husband. I have a male cat. We've had all male cats. It's like I'm the only girl until I got granddaughters and daughters-in-law. So, it's just, we need to view, we don't need to force or push our feminism, our femininity on the Bible, because God already elevates us to a very loving, high, protected, I don't even know the right words to say, but we're precious in his eyes. We're daughters of the King if we love him, and we can't imagine what he has in store for us. So I love telling the stories about the women, although I didn't used to like writing about women because I had sons, but I do now because I hope women out there can see how much God loves them and isn't against them, isn't out to get them, isn't putting them down, isn't siding with male oppression, isn't none of that. It isn't true, and if you really understand scripture from beginning to end, you'll see that picture, but you have to. I feel like if you're going to write biblical fiction from a truly, if I believe the Bible's true point of view, because not everybody does. Some people just use it as a book of history, and that's their choice. It's not my choice. But I feel like if I'm going to write about it, I have to understand as best I can the whole of it. I can't just pick and choose what I like. I have to take all of it. And honestly, I don't get it all. I'm listening to Leviticus right now going, Lord, why on earth did you have this have to be the purification for a skin disease? Really? How does that? I don't get this at all, and someday maybe he'll explain it to me, but I don't understand. and some things I won't, but some things he'll give me this epiphany and I'll go, well, that makes sense. It could be that way. Maybe that's what you meant,
Yeah.
so you'll not, my dad read the Bible cover to cover every year that I can remember. And you never stop learning something new. And
Well, and I would think that the fun part about the last, well, I was going to say the last 10 years, that's just the amount of time that you've been publishing, but all this time that you've been studying in order to make as accurate and also like just great stories about these people, I would think that the more you study anything, honestly, I mean, the more I study neuroscience, the more I'm like, this is so cool. And then I find all these little things where somebody says something in a neuroscience book, then I'm like, I know a Bible verse that says almost that exact same thing in different words. I think it must be just really interesting and exciting and fulfilling, just on a personal level, aside from what you're doing professionally, to just be exploring all of this history in the kind of depth that you would have to write the books that you write.
yeah, I mean, I suppose sometimes I don't. I mean, I feel like I'll have written books that are already in print, and then I'll find something and go, oh, I probably should have known that before I wrote that book. You're never going to get it all. You're never going to remember everything that's there. But like, if you don't know the new when you're writing about the old, for instance, Abraham and Lot, we know about Sodom and Gomorrah. We know God destroyed them. We think we know why based on Genesis, but in Ezekiel, he tells us more. And I just happened to run across that when I wrote that book. But then if you don't know what Peter says about Lot in the New Testament, you have no idea that he was a good man. He was a godly man who didn't like his city, but he was living there anyway. And you're like, why the heck are you living here? Yeah. It's like, this isn't a good place. These men are violent. And I mean, violence was a huge, big deal back in that town. And he's like, I just don't understand what drew them there, except that even though he didn't like where he was at, maybe he just got so used to it that the culture around him, he didn't want to make waves. He didn't want to stand out. And maybe his family liked it better than living in tents. I don't know, but you wouldn't know about Lot, and why. You would have thought God saved him only because Abraham asked him to, not also that maybe Lot found a little bit of favor in God's eyes because he was, according to Peter, a godly man. But you have to know all of Scripture, at least a little bit. You have to keep going back, keep trying to search it out, because I feel like I know a lot of people think the Old Testament, and I'll just say this, they think the stories are just not, they're just stories. They're fiction. Okay. I've heard these arguments. My take, we know that Jesus was a historical, real person who lived. And if he names a person in the New Testament that's named in the Old, like Jonah and Abraham's mentioned, and Queen of Sheba, I mean, just to name a few, then if he knew who they were, then they were real. As far as I'm concerned, he confirms their reality. So you might not find it in archaeology yet, but keep digging. You will someday.
Yeah. And from a story perspective, it's really interesting the way that you have taken what sometimes is very little and made it totally believable. Like during the whole book of Star of Persia, whenever Mordecai is wondering to himself, or whenever Esther is asking him, why didn't we go back to Jerusalem when the other Jews left? Why are we still here? I don't know how much was, me reading between the lines, and that's not really what you meant, but when you're a reader, it doesn't matter. You're reading and making your own guesses about people's motivations and stuff. And I was like, oh, here it seems to be like maybe Mordecai was thinking, well, I've got a good job, so this is the best place for my family. Or maybe here he was thinking, Jerusalem is like totally sacked and it would be too much work to take my little, small children. I shouldn't go now. And when the kids are so small, I could do it later. Or like all the time when something was going on, and I'd be like, oh, if he's thinking my kids are too small to make that kind of a journey, live in a city that's like in ruins and that we're rebuilding, like I totally get that. Or if he was thinking, got a really good job and I can feed all the mouths that I have. Like, I was like, yeah, I can totally see that. And yet on the times when he was like, what was I doing? Have I disobeyed God? And how does that make me feel? I was like, yeah, I can see that too. And it made it just a really enjoyable read, because that's the same way that I feel about, Harry Dresden, this wizard that I read about who works with the Chicago Police Department. It's one of my favorite books, series. Of course, I don't really believe in wizards, but whenever he is wondering whether or not he's doing the right or the wrong thing, or he changes his mind later and thinks, oh, that was the wrong thing, I just thought it was the right thing at the time. I'm like, see, the thing that I love about story is that it makes me feel like, oh yeah, all these other people in the world are just like me. Like, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing now, but maybe later I'll be able to figure out whether or not this was a good or bad decision. So I just really enjoyed the way you made it seem so natural, that why people might be thinking what they're thinking and how they question their own choices. I'm like, yes, that's me.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that it worked out. I try to just figure out who the character is a little bit. And when I start, I begin by casting characters, and I'll get pictures of people as I envision them. And so when I'm writing about them, it's not so much that I've written out everything. Oh, he's got brown hair and brown eyes and his beard's down to here. I don't do that. But in fact, my editor probably wishes I had more descriptions, because I just don't. I look at the pictures, and I try to think of what their character was like. And it builds as I first draft it. And, with Mordecai, I've read versions where it's just her, Hadassah, and Mordecai. That's it. But I'm thinking, but a man in Jewish culture, he would have had a wife. Would he have had other kids? Maybe not in Persia. Maybe he would have been single, but it just, in the culture of the day, there weren't too many families that didn't have, that you either were in some kind of family, and if you were single, you ended up usually married. I mean, look at Jacob and his two daughters. He made sure Leah got married off as well as Rachel, and much to Jacob's chagrin and unhappiness, and Rachel's total frustration, but it was still not going to be that, you can't not have one daughter unmarried. That just wasn't the culture. And it may still be true in some cultures today. They want to see, everyone is married and has families. And I mean, that's a really big deal. I live in a very ethnic neighborhood, and they have huge families. And I don't know that I did have a neighbor one time years and years ago. I forget what country they were from, but they had an arranged marriage too. So some of that still goes on.
Yeah.
And,
I worked with a girl in Phoenix, and she and her husband had an arranged marriage from when they were just small children.
wow.
Yeah. And I was like, really? But I'm looking at them, and we were good enough friends that I was like, so do you love each other? And she's laughing. She's like, of course we love each other. We grow to know each other, and then you like each other, and then you love each other. And I'm like, all right, well, that sounds reasonable. And then we had a friend whose family's from Hong Kong, I think. And she was saying that it's just, sometimes it's crazy because her family has certain expectations of it. She lives in the 21st century for sure, like the kind of job she has and the life that she leads and everything. But from a family perspective, there are things that she's expected to not do until people ahead of her, older than her, older siblings, do those things first, or that she's expected to take care of her younger brother if he needs it, even though she's the responsible one with a job, and maybe he's not always, but still it's her job because she's older. And I'm like, wow.
That's not how our family works, but okay.
Yeah. So it's really interesting, all the, and having moved around to a couple of countries now, it's just, I find people so fascinating. You must feel the same way with all the research that you do.
People are. I don't get out enough, I think, we've traveled a lot in the U.S., but we've only been to Israel as far as outside the country, and Canada, which really doesn't feel like out of the country.
Not if you live in Michigan. That's how I felt too.
Yeah. And I would love someday to visit Europe, because my roots are in Europe and so are my husband's. A mixture, of different countries. I thought I was more German than I am, but I actually got a little more on my dad's side, I think, than uh, my mom's. But anyway, I'd love to, but I'd love to go to the Mediterranean. I'd love to see a lot of places, but I don't travel well. And our kids are all on the West Coast, so we tend to travel to see the kids, but I also feel like maybe we'll just go on a few trips by ourselves while we can, because we're
Yeah.
not getting any younger. So
Yeah. Oh,
anyway,
wow.
but people are interesting and some are difficult. Some
Yeah.
are, and those are the ones that I find it hard when God says, love everybody, your neighbor, your enemy, everyone.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's when you run into the really difficult personalities that want to make life hard, that's hard to deal with, Some
Yeah.
people you click with and you're best buds right away. And other people, it's like just a challenge. But I think God grows me when I run into those situations. So
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And also, again, when I was reading Star of Persia, when I was reading about some of the things that Amestris was doing, the kind of wicked wife, and it's interesting now. Of course, I'm dying to know, like, what are all the cruel, horrible things that the real woman did that you can't put in your book? But even the things that she was doing, I would sometimes be feeling sorry for her, thinking, okay, you were raised as a princess with certain expectations. You married a king and you had certain expectations and you were promised, excuse me, promised certain things, or at least it made it sound to you like these expectations would be fulfilled. And yet you're one of, I don't know, but it certainly sounded like dozens, 100, a few hundred wives. You may not ever see your husband unless he just feels like he's in the mood for you. I'm like, okay, how in the world, like, you don't get anything you want and you're not even loved? Like, at least Esther, the way that you wrote her, was that maybe she actually was loved by the king, which is at least something for all of the other
yeah, and
wickedness.
I think he loved Vashti, and Esther at least made him feel something, for him to
Yeah.
pick her, because their age difference had to be big.
Yeah.
And but
I thought
unless,
about it for 1 second and I'm like, ew, 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 don't think about it anymore.
well, what's really weird, if you do the math, you should do the math sometime. I won't give it all away, but Jacob and Rachel were really far apart.
Really? I did
Yeah,
not know that.
you stop and add it up from how old he was when he went down to Egypt and how old Esau's got married when he was 40, and Jacob still wasn't even over in the
Oh,
land to meet Rachel. So you add it all up, and he was pretty old, and you go like, that's so weird. That's so
yeah,
weird. But we don't understand it because our cultures aren't the same. And
yeah,
they lived a lot longer, so it was very
yeah.
different back then. But I mean, I was just trying to picture, I'm reading Genesis right now, and I'm trying to picture all these people and, like, after the flood, how they had to have married their sisters and then had married their cousins, and,
Yeah,
and just very strange, long lives. But after the flood, less and less and less, they lived. And at
yeah,
one time, I think the lifespan might have been 120, and then it kind of got down to about 70. And that was when, as long as David lived, but Solomon was less than him. So when you read the math, but you got to kind of figure it out. And I do those kinds of things too. But
yeah.
I forgot your question. I'm sorry.
No, I think I think it was just being chatty about, yeah, the ages in between people and
Yeah,
yeah,
very different, very different times.
yeah.
But yeah, and oh, Xerxes and Amestris, you had asked about her. She had, they were both kind of cruel in a lot of ways. One rumor was that he had an affair with his son's wife.
Oh, I read that in your book.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I'm like, okay, I can't put that in there because I didn't have the son old enough to be married.
yeah,
And because of that and some other things, it said Amestris did some really, like a murder. but I won't tell you how cruel it was.
Wow.
So she's accused of some pretty bad stuff, and I just thought, no, my readers don't want to read about this, and it doesn't fit Esther's story anyway. So
yeah,
and who
but you
knows if
do
it's
have
true.
things, right? Yeah. Yeah, I know that with history, you're usually looking for more than one place to
Right.
corroborate. Yeah. But you do have a couple of times when you're like, holy cow, like, maybe I've seen this in a movie or something about, Ben-Hur or something, but how quickly he would just like have someone killed. Like he gets mad. He's sure that they're at fault. So he just has them killed today. I'm thinking, man, what if you found out later, like tomorrow, you were wrong? Well, they're already dead now. Golly.
Well, when I have him in the story kill some the messengers, in the Vashti scene, that's my imagination. There's nothing in scripture that says he did that. So, and there's, some people speculate that Vashti was murdered, but there's no evidence that she was. So I wasn't going to put that in there either. So anyway.
So many people. Well, listen, we probably should wrap this up, but I wonder if there's time just for a minute. That you have just finished your second book of nonfiction as well. And as I said before we started recording, I don't get enough people on talking about nonfiction. Can you just tell us a little bit, like, what is the book about and how does it differ in the way that you write that versus the way that you have been writing this, ancient history, biblical fiction?
Well, both books they're not really a series. They're both standalones. The one, When Life Doesn't Match Your Dreams, is in the same style as She Walked Before Us, where I do still use biblical fiction as a tool at the start of every chapter. And in the middle of the chapter, I have a short scene so that you can get into the kind of feeling of what that woman might have felt at that time. Like Eve, after she broke the world, Noah's wife, she has a point of view. Potiphar's wife has a point of view. I bring all those. That was in the last book, When Life. But She Walked Before Us is a more positive, I guess you could say, because When Life, there's certain elements that are memoirish, but there's certain that aren't, or some that aren't. But it focuses a lot more on how hard life can be. And gives some hope and verses and things at the end. But this one is more like the original title I had for it was Turning Trials into Triumph, but because it's still about the trials because the women still went through them. Every woman in scripture, they didn't have easy lives. I mean, and some of these women I thought would be easy to write about because they're wives of David. I already had known about them. And they were horribly hard because they were Ahinoam, whose son raped his sister. They were Maacah, whose daughter was raped. And whose son killed his brother. And Ahinoam's son was also killed for that rape. And, different ones. Abigail, I think, was possibly at least verbally abused because Nabal was a complete fool and worse. The definitions for his name are more than just what we think of as a fool. He wasn't just funny fool. He was cruel fool. And so I have not experienced any of that. And I didn't know how to do that. So I had to find the right theme to go with it and to show a more positive. I wanted a more positive spin on this book because I wanted to give women more hope. Not that the first one doesn't, but I wanted it to be even more helpful. So, because I think that's really, God's the God of hope. And I wanted people to see that even in the Old Testament, he was giving people hope and grace and faith. And so often we miss that there's grace. We think we live in an age of grace because the law, we are not under the Jewish law as Christians, but there was grace just woven throughout every story of the Old Testament too. We just don't look for it. Yeah. And so I tried to pull that out in that book. So we'll see how it does.
And when does that one come out?
I'm not positive the date exactly, but I think September 2020.
Okay. So
So
7, 8 months, something like that.
yeah,
All
yeah.
right.
Start edits in March, and probably, well, I won't be working when I'm um not, I won't be working part of April, but I'll probably have most of the edits done by April at some point. I don't know
Nice.
when she's going to send it to me, so we'll
Yeah,
see.
that's true. Sometimes they wait 3 months and then they ask you, can you get that back to us in a week?
Oh, my editor's not like that.
Oh, that's good.
She's so good. I hope I never
Oh,
have another editor like that. I mean, I've worked with Jessica for every book, and I hope she never leaves Ravel, because I hope as long as I'm with Ravel, I get to keep her as my editor.
nice.
Yeah,
Oh.
she's
Well,
great.
hello, Jessica. You sound wonderful.
She is.
Writers want to know that there are great editors out there who aren't going
Yes.
to.
She always has a good suggestion when I don't word it right. And I just
Nice.
trust her to fix all my commas now. I don't even, if they're wrong,
Wow.
I just let her, I don't even bother to question anything on certain things. Um, I do actually have two editors. You first have an acquisitions editor that gets you the contract and accepts the book, and then they turn it off to the editor who goes line by line, word by word, and corrects whatever is wrong. And that's,
Okay.
but I had Lonnie Hall DuPont for all of my career until this year. She retired in 2019, and now I have Rachel McCrae, and she's edited my nonfiction, or edited my nonfiction. But Miriam will be edited by Lonnie one last time, and then everything will go over to Rachel. So it'll
Oh,
be getting, more time to get to meet Rachel. That'll be fun. But I
yeah.
miss Lonnie because, she's cool. She's really
Yeah.
great. But
Oh, nice. And do
anyway,
you have a expected publication date for Miriam? Probably 2021?
yeah, they're always usually March of the following year. So
Okay.
they're due in March typically, and they're also released a year later in March because it takes them time. They begin asking me for title suggestions and all the things about them in like December, the year before I've even finished the book or turned it in. So
Okay.
they work way ahead, and they have to do the cover art, and they get it in the catalog, comes out early because they want to show it to the buyers. So
Yeah.
it's really complicated. And I have a great marketing team and a publicity team, and they just let me write the book. And I do a little self-promotion to help them, like throw out graphics up there and tell people about it as best I can. But man, they do a lot for me, and I'm really, really grateful.
Yeah. Every time I talk to someone who's published with Baker Revell and they happen to mention, some of this details like this,
Mhm.
it's always with this feeling that they're very organized, they know what they're doing, they do good work, and they make authors be very glad that they are working together.
Yes, yes, they're great teams. We've had a few people come and go, but I mean, Michelle, my marketing manager, has been there forever, and she's great. And I've had a few different publicists, and I really love Karen. I hope she stays on for a long time. I don't know her future plans, but I mean, no one new has ever been bad. They've always
Yeah.
been a good team. So they make wise choices, and I like most all their books that I've read. So
Nice.
yeah, I'm
Well,
grateful.
a shout out to Karen and Michelle, who also send me very kind emails about the interviews that I do with some of their people. So, oh, this is great. It's always fun talking to writers that they're doing something that I never would have thought of writing, or just it's also really nice to read a book that all the way through you're like, this is great. This doesn't feel like work to me right now. I just need to know what happens next. And the thing is, I know the story of Esther. I know what happens next, but I want to know how you're going to say it.
Yeah, I'm really, really glad you enjoyed it because I can put most books down. And so when I get a book I can't put down, to me, a book I
Joy.
love. It is.
Yeah.
And, so I'm grateful when anyone says that about mine too, because, I'm sure people can put mine down, they don't tell me. They probably just
Right.
are the ones that don't write me, right? I don't know.
Right. Awesome. Well, listen, okay, Star of Persia, brand new. And where
Mhm.
can listeners find out more about you and all of your books?
Well, I lots of places. I have a website, JillEileenSmith.com, And on it, I blog. I try to blog once a week. It's called my journal. You can find all my books listed there under either fiction or nonfiction. And if you click the tabs, it'll bring up all the books, and then it'll have a learn more and bring up all the places you can buy it. And there is the Amazon link on all of them is an affiliate link, because that's the only program I could get into. I'd be affiliate with others, but you had to meet a certain threshold I couldn't meet. So anyway, and I haven't checked everyone, but the ones I did check. But I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. I just search Jill Eileen Smith on everything. Okay. Twitter. And I post on Instagram. It goes to Facebook. It goes to Twitter. But I'm most active in answering questions on Facebook, because people tend to respond there more. Mm-hmm. If my blog's up, they'll answer me there than on my blog. They don't always respond there. So I'm on Pinterest, but I haven't looked at it in forever. And so I want to, but I just haven't had time. I had made storyboard, for every book series, or each book I would make a new Pinterest board, but I just ran out of time for continuing to do that. So maybe I'll catch up one of these days.
Yeah. And because some people might be running on the treadmill or driving in the car. So Jill, regular spelling, Jill, Eileen is EILEEN, and Smith, regular spelling with an I. Mm-hmm. JillEileenSmith.com. Yeah. And Jill Eileen Smith on most of the social media then.
Right. Yep. Awesome. Yep. I was always a Smith, and I married a Smith, which is why I use my middle name. So
how funny!
Yeah.
My gosh,
I'm sure it's not as uncommon as it sounds, but yeah.
Well, it's funny. I told you that one of my friends had an arranged marriage in India, and her maiden name and her husband's last name were the same, so she didn't change her name when she got married either.
No, it was easy. I didn't have to do anything, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Jill, this has been great fun. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing so much with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great. It's been fun meeting you too.